It is my pleasure to welcome Jay Meier back to this stage. Jay is the author of the PKI fallacy, the senior vice president of Face Tech, which is coming off of another year of significant growth. It hit a major milestone, processing over 1 billion liveness checks, and that's an annualized statistic. It's groundbreaking. And they've just also tripled their very unique, one-of-a-kind spoof bounty program. It now has payouts that go up to a total of $600,000. So if you want to make a little bit more money after playing our raffles, you know where to go. Here he is, Jay Meier from Face Tech. Welcome back to the stage.
Thanks, Peter. Raffles? Wait a minute. Where do I sign up for that?
Yeah. So you're just adding us to the stream.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Take it away, Jay. It's all yours.
Yeah. I encourage anybody to go to www.liveness.com or www.spoofbounty.com to learn more about what we do, our 3D face liveness and matching technology. But we'll talk about that later, maybe. I'm going to talk about a few things today. I call this sort of identity security fundamentals. And you know, it's interesting that Francis talks about how disjointed the industry is and how there's these pieces that all kind of stay in their lane. And that is actually a big problem in the industry. It is the place, those spaces between the components. The loose connection between the components is where the identity theft and breaches actually occur. So I want to talk about some basic fundamentals and how they need to be connected, right? Remote identity verification, bad data in is bad data out. If you don't know who you are enrolling for a service, enrolling in a system on the internet, then you can't know who is accessing your privilege that you're granting them. You can't know who you are authenticating later. Credentials are critically important, and there's a lot of confusion about what actually a credential is and does, okay? A credential is something that represents things that are unique to a specific human being, and whether those are privileges or aspects of that person. Credentials are a way to present what's unique about that person, right? Binding is a concept that seems a little bit intuitive, right? But it's amazing how many people don't understand what binding is and how many salespeople in this industry don't understand that the technology has to be, these components have to be bound together, right? And that binding is probably the white elephant, and the transferability of authenticators and credentials are the white elephant in the room that nobody's talking about. That is the looseness that I think Francis may have been referring to. And I want to talk a little bit about liveness-proven face biometrics and why that is a clear solution to the problems here. Okay, so I have this slide repeatedly. This is actually a new version. This is from 2022, the Verizon 2022 Data Breach Investigations Report. It's nothing new. I could have used the 21 slide because they're almost identical, okay? Breaches occur because credentials are stolen or misused, okay? The fundamental problem with our identity management systems is that our credentials are not sufficiently bound to an actual human being and the privileges that that human being enjoys. We're binding things inappropriately. Oops. So, perfect example. I talk about this all the time, SolarWinds. It is a clinic, a textbook on how to do this wrong, okay? According to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the Department of Homeland Security, they used, the Russian hacker used password guessing, password spraying, and took advantage of inappropriately secured administrative credentials so that he could access these systems remotely. I mean, this is what we're talking about, right? So I want you to think about this in terms of identity verification, credentials, binding, authentication, okay? Let's just move on. SolarWinds, it turns out, was an epic remote identity verification, binding, and authentication failure. They did almost none of this appropriately. And it gave this hacker a huge opportunity to get into that network and start uploading Trojan malware payloads. Remote identity verification, literally what happened is that a Russian hacker was able to steal passwords from an employee of a company. And using those passwords, he was able to enroll his laptop computer into the employer's network as if it was the employee's computer. Okay. In order to do that, the network, the system, the employer had to believe that this was actually the employee enrolling the computer on the network. But they didn't verify that this was actually the employee. They didn't even try to make sure this was the employee. Epic fail. Credentials. Well, they used some credentials. They used what's called a SAML token, which is a cryptographic credential that's bound to a device, the laptop computer, right? And the credential is actually very strong. It's irrefutable. The problem is that the credential was transferable, or they didn't know who they were attaching the credential, what they were attaching the credential to, who was in control of the device that credential was attached to. And this is an issue of binding, okay? Authenticators and credentials that aren't derived from a human being, that are at least 1 degree separated from an actual human being, they can all be transferable, okay, to someone else. And this is what hackers are trying to do. This is why they want your credentials, because they can use them, right, to steal things and break things. And it turns out that liveness-proven face biometrics are really the best way to solve for the vulnerabilities of these other elements. So last year, I was asked to participate in a thing called the FINCEN Tech Sprint Challenge. FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It's part of the U.S. Department of Treasury. It's the organization that administrates know your customer, know your client, and anti-money laundering stuff. So when you hear KYC, right, they're talking about FinCEN. FinCEN is the one that administrates that and regulates that across banking and certain other financial institutions. So in their Tech Sprint Challenge recently, they asked a whole pile of us, they split us into teams, and they asked each team to put their thinking caps on and answer this problem. What is a scalable, cost-efficient, risk-based solution to measure the effectiveness of digital identity proofing, parentheses verification, to ensure that individuals who remotely present themselves for financial activities are who they claim to be? Okay. Of course, everybody in the room started trying to tell them why their particular proprietary product was the best and why this solves all their problems. And that wasn't even the question. So once everybody put their head back where it belonged, okay, we started asking these questions, right? What makes a good remote identity verification system good, right? Well, one question that's interesting is, why are they asking this question in the first place? Why is FinCEN, the regulator of know your customer, why are they asking for advice about how to evaluate remote identity proofing systems? Well, it either means that they don't know how to evaluate them, or it means that the people they regulate don't know how to evaluate them, which kind of implies that, generally speaking, no one's doing this, okay? In fact, the IDV industry, the identity verification industry for remote identity verification, is relatively new. It shouldn't be. It should have been going on for decades, but it hasn't. It really emerged because of the problems that resulted in the pandemic. So this is a new concept, and people aren't getting it right. People don't do it very well. So how do we evaluate that? Well, speaking of, bad data in is bad data out. The reason identity verification is so important is because if you don't know who you're enrolling for a service, if you don't know who you're giving a bank account to, you don't know who's using the bank account, and you don't know who you're authenticating later to give them access to the bank account, right? And speaking of bad data in, our credentials today are flawed. Our physical credentials today are fake. Okay, for less than $100, you can buy a fake credential from an organization in China that looks, smells, feels exactly like a real driver's license or a real passport. So when your IDV vendor says, oh, you can do a selfie to a driver's license picture, ask them how they know that the picture isn't fake. Okay, this is a new thing. Not all of these companies are very good at this. So I want to talk about credentials real quick. There's a couple different kinds. There's this kind, right? A credential represents things that are unique about an individual. A human being. A credential shows a face, which is how we identify that this human being. It represents data about that person, like where they live, what their name is, what their driver's license number is, blah, blah, blah. And it also includes privileges that person, that identity is allowed to use, like driving on a public road, right? Or accessing government services, right? Well, if those are flawed and we shouldn't use them anymore, then industry will come up with a new kind of credential. And we have these cryptographic credentials right now, which is exactly the point of the SolarWinds thing, right? The cryptographic token, the SAML token that was attached to the device did not save anything. In fact, it enabled the fraud because the SAML token has nothing to do with the person that's in control of the device, right? So if the device doesn't know that you're not the employee, then the employer doesn't know that you're not the employee. And that SAML token is the thing that told the employer that this was the employee. It doesn't work, okay? Most of our identity management schemes today, the new forward-looking ones, when they talk about crypto and they talk about cryptography and they talk about, validating devices and validating data and validating credentials, they're really strong cryptographic objects and device authentication. But that doesn't tell you anything about who's in control of the device. Okay. Again, any credential or an authenticator that is at least 1 degree separated from the human privilege owner can be transferred to someone else, just like the SAML token, just like a password, right? A password, that's the problem. Everybody can, if I have your password, your computer doesn't know that I'm not you, right? The PKI fallacy speaks to this. It's a false logic progression suggesting that when a public key infrastructure certificate, cryptographic token, or device is authenticated, that somehow we know who the user is. We don't. And that is just a falsehood that needs to be addressed. In fact, biometrics are the only authenticator derived from a physical human being. This is why biometrics are so important, right? Biometrics cannot be simply transferred to someone else, right? Someone could steal your biometric potentially and misrepresent themselves as you, but we can solve for that problem, right? We can solve for that problem in a number of different ways. There's one thing that people need to understand. Not all biometrics are the same. We look at our phone today, and it uses face biometrics, right? Or fingerprint biometrics. Well, those biometrics are anonymous on your phone. Your phone doesn't associate that biometric information with any identity profile anywhere. So your phone doesn't know that it's you. It just knows that it's the right fingerprint or the right face, which means that if I got your phone, I could potentially enroll my face on your phone or my fingerprint on your phone, or your kid could do it, and your phone wouldn't know that I'm not you. And that means the third-party service provider, the app, the bank, cannot know that I am not you. That is a real problem, folks. So, Francis talks about the circle of trust. I talk about the circle of truth or something like that, circle of trust. I talk about the triangle of trust. Okay. There are 3 elements here. There is face biometrics. There is a credential, right? And then there are permissions, rights, and privileges. Those all need to be bound together. And that's what this thing does, only it doesn't do it very well. The face is the biometric that binds this human being to that identity profile, what's listed in the DMV. Okay. It connects this face to J. Meier. And it is also the thing that connects privileges that J. Meier is entitled to that identity profile and by default to the face that's represented. In electronic and remote unsupervised environments, we simply are not doing this. They are disconnected. That binding does not happen effectively. And what we've been doing is binding these things to a device. Okay, the cryptographic SAML token that enabled the SolarWinds breach, that was bound to a device irrefutably. It was a great token. It works really well, and we know that because of that credential, that device was allowed to log on. And guess what? The employer didn't know that the Russian hacker was not the employee, and that credential actually enabled the fraud. Okay, so we need to bind a liveness-proven biometric to identity data somewhere. That identity data needs to be verified. We need to know that this human being is actually the person represented by the identity data, right? And then we have to bind the rights, permissions, and privileges to both. So later, when this person tries to access those privileges online, we can authenticate that person using the same thing that binds them all together. So we know that it is actually Jay Meier trying to access these privileges. And if we do that, our problems are solved. So let's talk about biometric verification and what makes it truly strong. Okay, first of all, you want to verify the integrity of the sensor on the device, the camera. You want to verify the integrity of the data that's being collected, the flow from that device. That's what cryptography really does. Okay, you want to verify that the legal identity exists and that this person is actually that legal identity, right? And then you want to bind them all together at enrollment. Then you want to make sure that you capture as much data as you can. The more data you capture, the stronger confidence you can have in the outcome. Most of the face recognition capabilities out there are pretty weak. They don't actually work all that well in a remote unsupervised environment, right? They might work well in the NIST labs, but they don't necessarily work so well out there. One of the advantages of three-dimensionality is that it collects a lot more data. So it's potentially a lot more accurate, right? You want to capture liveness and matching data concurrently. Not only does this reduce friction, right? If the liveness data is captured from the same data flow as the biometric face matching data, then you don't have to ask somebody to turn his head and cough later, or you don't have to ask somebody to wait for the sprinkling lights to flicker on their face or anything like that. It reduces friction, but it also allows you to do something else. It allows you to ensure that when you enroll this biometric data and you bind it, you can remove the liveness data, and what's left is solely matching data. But if the system requires the combination of liveness data and matching data together, if someone stole that biometric data, that matching data, and tried to resubmit it, the system would reject it because it lacks the appropriate liveness data. And since the liveness should be passive, nobody's going to know how to reconnect liveness data to the matching data, right? So by removing liveness data and altering the biometric data so that it cannot be resubmitted, you actually mitigate the honeypot risk that so many people are worried about. And that's why at FaceTech, we don't have problems this way. We've never had this problem because the data cannot be resubmitted. So hopefully I have shed some more light on things. I'm not so sure I did, but I think I made it within my time frame. I'm pretty excited about that. If you need to get a hold of me, you can reach me at the above coordinates. Yeah. Peter, I think I'm done.
I mean, you are done, but believe it or not, you're actually ahead of time, Jay. So
no way.
Yeah. So if you want, we had some questions in the audience for you to sort of expand on
Okay.
importance of biometric binding or binding.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, if you have it. Oh, go ahead. I mean, just if you don't mind expanding on.
Just expand on biometric binding. Okay. Well, first of all, we need to bind authenticators to a human being, and we need to bind identity data to a human being, right? If you bind all of those things and then you bind to privileges that are associated with that identity, right? Mm-hmm. That's what authenticators try to accomplish, right? Presumably, if you have some kind of a token or a device or a stick, you have one of these sticks and you can stick it in the computer and the computer says, oh, well, that's the right stick. And the guy entered the right password. Potentially, that means that it's the right guy sitting at the computer. It's an attempt to bind a human being to privileges and an identity. The problem is that that's transferable, okay? Somebody else could get your password. And, protecting a stick with a password kind of means you're protecting the whole system with a password, right? Those are the kinds of things that the hackers are trying to steal, right? So they can get in. So the thing about a biometric is that if you can demonstrate that this is a live person standing in front of the camera, okay, within milliseconds, we know that this is a live person standing there, and we can accurately match his face against the stored value that's already bound to the identity data, then you know that it is actually the right guy standing in front of the camera, right? And that is useful in enrollment for verification, and it is useful in authentication when that person tries to access those privileges later. The biometrics are the only authenticator, only verifier that cannot be transferred to someone else. They are, well, let's say it this way. They are derived from the physical human being. It's the only one. And that's why they're so strong. That's why they are so superior to other types of authenticators. Make sense?
That does make sense. Fantastic. Well, Jay, I think that's also a great way to end on. I want to just say, always appreciate having you here. Can't wait to have you back. And yeah, I mean, it's great that we're having these conversations. Everybody, if you want to get in touch with Jay, you know how. And Jay, I'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.